Let's pass on to Madam Fotyga's report, EU Strategic Communication to Counteract Anti-EU Propaganda by Third Parties. The first person to speak will be Marek Jurek. 1 minute, over to you. I'm happy that the report on hostile propaganda reminds us of the fact that communism used to destroy the identity and traditions of the nations under the influence of the Soviet Union. The instrument of that fight was historical lie, and unfortunately it's still used in the post-communist politics of Russia. I'm happy that we are appealing that we remember the crimes of communism, and at the same time we fulfill the duty of remembering its victims. I still regret that we haven't yet condemned what is practiced in Russia, the cult of the leaders of Bolshevism, but I hope that today's report is a good step in that direction, and it's also a good step to condemn the apology of the Soviet Union as a whole. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Deputy Hannan, take the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I want to echo what my friend and colleague, Mr. Jurek, just said. Marxism-Leninism must be reckoned in crude mathematical terms the most murderous ideology ever devised by human intelligence. And yet this is a point that has to be made anew in every generation. I saw an opinion poll the other day that showed that 1/3 of American millennials believe that George W. Bush killed more people than Stalin did. Well, here's a nice, easy way to remember the difference. The limerick comes courtesy of the great poet and historian Robert Conquest. There was an old bastard named Lenin who did 2 or 3 million men in. That's a lot to have done in. But where he did 1 in, that old bastard Stalin did 10 in.
Thank you, Deputy Hannan. Now, Deputy Jonathan Arnott. 1 minute, take the floor, please.
Thank you very much. This report is all about EU communication to counteract anti-EU propaganda. Now, I don't think that taxpayers' money should be spent on this, because I think it's very dangerous when the state starts getting involved with telling us what is and what is not acceptable to be said. But perhaps, being fair and reasonable people, perhaps the EU would be amenable to a compromise and to spend half of the money countering pro-EU propaganda. The same politicians who told us that leaving the EU would lead to World War III or the end of Western political civilization as we know it. Perhaps we could have a bit of help countering some of that propaganda. The UK government spent 10 million sending a booklet to every household with pro-EU propaganda, telling people to vote for the EU. But actually, one thing that you often find is that propaganda backfires. I'm sure it would be only too fair to counteract pro-EU propaganda and nonsense as well. But the chances of the EU voting for that? 0.
And now, Madam Diane James. 1 minute, take the floor, please.
Thank you. This report takes an extremely selective, aggressive, hostile and confrontational position towards Russia, ignoring other countries, and I emphasise other countries guilty of many of the same accusations. Now, my position and voting decisions should not, and I emphasise should not, be interpreted as defending Russia or even supporting Russia, but to register my support to stop the EU adding to an acknowledged poor and escalating negative relationship with Russia absolutely needlessly. Now, contributing to a return of a Cold War environment and mentality is unhelpful. Binding the United Kingdom to such inflammatory and confrontational statements is not in my country's interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Diane James. And now, Deputy Stephen Woolfe.
Thank you. Thank you,
Again.
Mr. Deputy Speaker. In the novel 1984 by George Orwell, he created a world of 3 continents at conflict with one another. The governments of the day in that novel managed to control its own people by the creation of propaganda. Their own propaganda was called newspeak, and they controlled people through having thought crimes. Just as in that book Oceania was against Eurasia, we now have proposals in this particular document that creates the EU against Russia. What we are saying here is that this creates propaganda within its own booklet. And I give you an example. The example is in that paragraph 1 of this report. It says Russia employs a wide range of tools such as Russia Today and Sputnik. Yet in paragraph 36 of this same report, it says that the EU must create its own communication policies and television companies to fight Russia. One propaganda against another doesn't mean it's fair.
Jako następny zabierze głos.
The next person to speak will be MEP Michał Marusik. 1 minute, over to you. Thank you very much, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I voted against this report. Like Ms. Macovei, I would like to quote George Orwell. It is George Orwell who perfectly well described the mechanism where there is a police of thoughts and the Ministry of Truth in a state as an institution that allows some content to become public. I know that world because we used to be under the influence of Moscow and we had censorship. We know what its consequences were, and the horrible world of George Orwell in Russia lost, but now it seems it's winning the ground in Western Europe. Well, you were allowed to speak freely and to communicate freely. Unfortunately, this is a symptom of the collapse, civilization collapse of the West, which used to be the oasis of freedom. I would like it to remain an oasis of truth. I'd like my home country to be a free country. I don't want any institutions to administer our thoughts. Even if I'm wrong, I would like to be able to say it publicly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Arnott. Deputy Sean Kelly, 1 minute, take the floor, please.
I supported this proposal, sharing the rapporteur's belief that combating anti-EU propaganda and disinformation by third countries is essential so as to uphold democratic values and a united Europe. EU citizens cannot effectively legitimise us and the work we do on their behalf if they do not have access to accurate information. Speaking from an Irish point of view, investing in education in order to better equip the public for critical thinking has long been a priority. As Franklin D. Roosevelt stated, democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. Given the prevalence of disinformation, stemming in particular nowadays from electronic means of dissemination such as social media, it is imperative that we collaborate on deconstructing such propaganda. I therefore welcome the recommendations offered in this report.
Thank you, Deputy Kelly.
MEP Macovei, over to you.
Thank you, President. George Orwell used to say, if thoughts corrupt language, then language corrupts thoughts. Propaganda births a new type of people and a new type of mentality. I've seen this. I saw this in the past in Romania and in other states, in ex-communist states in Central and Eastern Europe. And unfortunately, we see it today. The Russian Federation waited for years, built for years, and now they are attacking. They are attacking everywhere in Central and Eastern Europe through propaganda, and they started to cross over to direct acts. They use the Russian language. They buy licenses in ex-communist states, TV and radio licenses. And they are going to broadcast, or they already started broadcasting, in Russian. So the minds of people are slowly converted by Russian propaganda. We should stop being naive. And we should recognize the fact that history can repeat itself if we don't pay attention. Yes, we can go back under Russian influence, and maybe even more, if we don't pay attention, if we don't believe that this is possible. Let us not imagine that we earned freedom and democracy once and for all. No, On the contrary, this is the moment when Russia attacks again, and we must stand united, and we must wake people up, because people just don't realize what's happening. Thank you.
Mulțumesc.